Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the pages of Lee Kuan Yew's foundational memoir, The Singapore Story. Together, we're going to explore the dramatic and, quite frankly, completely unexpected birth of a modern nation.
All right, let's kick things off by shattering a pretty common myth. You know, when most of us think of Singapore today, we picture this incredibly wealthy, highly stable, well-oiled global hub, right? It almost feels like its success was just inevitable. But the reality of 1965 Singapore was entirely different. We're talking vulnerable, utterly devoid of natural resources, and, get this, its independence was definitely not some joyous celebration. It was a sudden, shocking event born out of fear and intense racial tension. So Lee Kuan Yew presents his country not as a miracle destined to happen, but as an island that very, very nearly didn't make it.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the actual motivation behind the memoir itself. Picture this: Lee Kuan Yew at work, typing out early drafts on a home computer. He specifically wrote this first volume for a younger, much more comfortable generation of Singaporeans. He was actually deeply troubled by what he saw as the overconfidence of a generation that had really only ever known stability and economic growth. He wanted to anchor them in reality. He needed to remind them that honest government, public order, and honestly, basic national survival, those things didn't just happen by accident. They were forged through some immense struggle.
Part 1. The Crucible of Power. Let's look at British rule and the Japanese occupation.
So to truly understand Lee's intense political realism, we've got to look at the era of unquestioned British colonial rule, and then its incredibly sudden collapse. Just take in this stark quote from Winston Churchill regarding the fall of Singapore in 1942. For decades, you see, the myth of white colonial supremacy was just absolute in Singapore. The British were the unquestioned bosses. But then, the sudden, catastrophic fall of the island to the Japanese in just 2 weeks, that completely demolished the illusion. For a young Lee Kuan Yew, seeing his supposedly invincible British masters defeated so thoroughly, well, it forever altered how he understood authority, vulnerability, and the really harsh realities of global power.
In Lee's own telling, the brutal 3.5-year Japanese occupation served as this harsh, real-world postgraduate course. He witnessed the absolute, merciless power of an occupying army, and saw firsthand how human societies basically just adjust to sudden, terrifying change just to survive. He realized something crucial here. Power wasn't just administrative, it was a vehicle for massive, revolutionary transformation. The occupation taught him that political order is, at its core, incredibly fragile.
Moving on to Part 2, the ideological battlefield, the rise of the PAP and the communist challenge. Following the sheer devastation of the war, a newly awakened Singapore became this incredibly complex web of labor movements and ideological struggles. Now, looking strictly through Lee's perspective here, we see a high-stakes, extremely dangerous political alliance. On one side, you've got Lee's English-educated PAP faction, and they're focused on constitutional, democratic methods. On the flip side, you have the highly organized, pro-communist forces. Their base was the Chinese-educated grassroots, and they favored strikes and revolutionary mass agitation. They formed a united front purely out of convenience to fight British colonialism, but they fundamentally didn't trust each other at all. It was a highly volatile marriage of convenience, to say the least.
Once the PAP actually managed to take office, they had to prove they could govern better than the communists could agitate. You literally had Lee Kuan Yew out there shoveling rubbish to set an example for keeping Singapore clean. To counter the deep reach of communist-backed unions, the PAP knew they couldn't just rely on fancy rhetoric. They had to deliver highly visible, effective governance right then and there. So they built community centers, organized civic action, and worked desperately to win over the grassroots support that the communists were also aggressively courting.
But you know, that kind of tension, it couldn't last. The ideological battle peaked in 1961, and this number, 12, represents the ultimate turning point. Lee delivered 12 dramatic, deeply suspenseful radio broadcasts to the nation. I want you to think of it as a gripping, real-life political thriller broadcast directly into people's living rooms. It was basically the social media of its day. In these 12 talks, he completely exposed the communist underground, detailing their tactics, their identities, and their ultimate goals. He used this massive platform to convince the public that the communist path would lead straight to ruin, and that merging with Malaya was literally the only realistic path left for Singapore's survival.
Which brings us to Part 3, the failed union, the push for merger, and the shock of separation. To Lee Kuan Yew, merging with Malaya wasn't just some nice idea, it was an absolute economic and geographic necessity. Singapore had zero natural resources. They didn't even have enough of their own drinking water. Now, this timeline illustrates just how rapid and volatile the escalation to merger and eventual separation truly was. In 1961, the proposal is made. By 1963, the Federation of Malaya is joyously formed. But then, look at how quickly it all collapses. By August 1965, just 2 short years later, catastrophic political friction results in Singapore being completely expelled.
So why did it fail so incredibly fast? Well, it essentially came down to fundamentally irreconcilable differences over racial politics. The PAP pushed for what they called a Malaysian Malaysia, a vision of strict multiracial equality where no single race had special political rights. But this directly threatened the central government in Kuala Lumpur, led by UMNO, because their entire political base was built on the concept of Malay supremacy. It was an ideological collision course, and frankly, neither side could back down.
Which leads us directly to this really heartbreaking quote. It will be a moment of anguish because all my life I have believed in merger and the unity of these two territories. When separation was announced, let me tell you, it was absolutely not a moment of triumph. Lee Kuan Yew famously wept on television. Independence was a deeply traumatic shock. It left a tiny Chinese majority island completely without natural resources, totally stranded in what they perceived to be a highly hostile Malay Sea. The very survival of the nation was entirely in question.
Let's pivot a bit for part 4, evaluating the memoir, strengths and subjective limitations.
Now, shifting away from the historical narrative itself for a second, we really have to evaluate this book as exactly what it is, a deeply personal memoir. Its undeniable strength is the unparalleled first-person access you get into the mind of a master political strategist. I mean, Lee's storytelling is gripping. It often reads way more like a cinematic thriller than some dry political textbook. You get these incredibly deep insights into the mechanical and often quite ruthless realities of nation-building. And he is remarkably candid about just how incredibly vulnerable the new state of Singapore truly was.
However, as an explainer, we also must impartially note its limitations, right? This book is written entirely through Lee's subjective political lens. It exhibits a very strong, uncompromising anti-communist bias, though remember, he was literally fighting them for his political life. The PAP's absolute political dominance is consistently framed throughout the text as an unavoidable necessity for survival. Because of this, the book leaves very little room for alternative historical views, particularly when it comes to the suppression of civil liberties and political opponents. So it's a brilliant account, absolutely, but it is one man's account.
And finally, part 5, the final verdict, why this book matters today.
So, what does this all mean, and where does that leave us? Well, despite its inherent biases, the Singapore story remains one of the most important political memoirs in modern Asia, simply because it wrestles with such timeless, high-stakes questions. I mean, how does a tiny, vulnerable nation actually survive in a hostile world? What really separates ordinary politicians from truly effective visionary leadership? And perhaps the most challenging question of all, how do developing nations balance the urgent, pressing need for public order and survival with the ideals of civil freedom?
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a rather provocative thought to chew on. How much of Singapore's incredible survival and eventual success was just destined by its geography, and how much of it was forged by the sheer, unyielding political will of one man and his founding generation? I highly encourage you to dive into the source material yourself, navigate this incredible, dramatic history, and decide where you stand. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep learning.